Thrilled to I'm thrilled to be here. I know, it's been so disappointing for lots of groups not to be able to have their in-person meetings. One of the advantages that I have heard, though, is that people have gotten lots of different speakers from many different areas. And so that's, true for me for sure. I definitely, unfortunately, wouldn't have been able to make it to Hamilton, but I can definitely make it to you and into your living rooms today. So that's fantastic. And today I'm going to be talking about the bats that you have in Ontario. It's very similar to the bats that we have here in Manitoba, except there's an extra 2 species. And a lot of our work that we do at the University of Winnipeg is actually funded by the government of Ontario, and we do work all the way across, well, not all the way across, but we do work to about the Bruce Peninsula. We used to have some bat houses in Sudbury, so we have quite a large study system. And actually this past year, most of our research was done in the Kenora region. And, the bats are actually, it's amazing. They're very intermingled in terms of genetic diversity. So they are considered one population. So I always like to start out whether my audience is 4 or 80, explaining exactly like what are bats and going through a little game that I like to call is this a bat, which you'll see in a minute. So very basic, what are bats? So this is a little mouse looking up at a bat saying, oh my goodness, an angel. So what I hear all the time are, oh, bats are just mice with wings, but they're actually quite different when you look at their life history. So, for example, a mouse can actually have up to 50 babies in a single year, whereas a bat will only have 1 to 2 babies a year. The oldest mouse just celebrated its 4th birthday, whereas the oldest bat was over 41 years old. And that's based on a bat that was banded and then caught later on 41 years later. And we in our study site have caught bats that are over 20 years old for sure, and likely many of them live into their 30s. So I like to say bats are more like little tiny flying bears when you look at their life history. So what actually are they? So bats are part of the group of mammals. So that means they have fur, they feed their babies with milk, they give live birth, and they're part of the order called Chiroptera. So they are not rodents, but they have their own order called Chiroptera, which is a really complicated sounding word, but it simply means hand wing. And that's because bats fly with their hands. So if you look at this picture here, this is the bat's elbow. And their forearm is pointing straight up, and then their thumbs are straight up, or this bat's thumbs are straight up into the air. It has its first 2 fingers together, and then here's its ring finger, its pinky, and then all of those are connected by webs. So the position of the bat's hand is kind of like this, and then the web from the pinky goes all the way to the ankle. And then bats may or may not have that web also connect to the tail membrane as well. And it's amazing because that ability, or that webbing, and the fact that it's connected to all of those digits means that bats have so much control. They just can, move their finger slightly and really change the direction that they're flying around. And so I'll show you a video in a little bit that really highlights how maneuverable and amazing bats are. Oh, and I meant to say at the beginning, but I'll say it now. If you have any questions that come up, please feel free to type them into the chat or into the question and answer box. It doesn't matter which one to me. And then about halfway through, I'll check those and we can go through the questions. And then at the end, I'll leave time for questions as well, so we can have a bit of a discussion then. So I just want everyone to look at this adorable picture of this animal and guess whether or not it is a bat. So it is a bat. These are Australian flying foxes. These are Australian flying foxes that have been rescued. So many Australian flying foxes were orphaned or suffered from heat exhaustion with Australia's extreme temperatures and with the wildfires as well. And so these are bats that have been are at a rehab facility. They're all bundled up so that they feel nice and snug. And there's a reason that they're called flying foxes. Their little faces look so much like foxes. These are bats that are generally awake in the daytime. They eat fruit and they have amazing vision. So many people think that bats are blind. You hear blind as a bat all the time, but all bats can see, and some bats can see amazingly well, especially those bats that rely on or that are eating fruit for their meals, because they really need to have good vision to see the fruit that they're trying to go after. And they have huge wingspans. These bats can be 5 feet or more from tip to tip. And this is just a big picture of a colony of Australian flying foxes. Okay, so is it a bat? So perhaps unsurprisingly, this bat is called the Bulldog Bat, as you can see from its big, big cheeks. These bats are amazing. They're found in Costa Rica and across Central and South America. They are bright, bright yellow, and they're actually fishermen. So they have long, long claws, which I'll show you in the next picture here. You can see their very long claws. And what they'll do is they'll hang out at a tree that's over top, or that they'll hang out at a tree that's right next to a pond or a lake, and they'll echolocate over the water. And if they detect a little ripple, then they know that a fish has come to the surface. So they'll leave the tree branch, swoop over top of the water with their big long claws, and then they can shove that fish into their huge mouth. And that's why they have lots of room in their mouth, because they'll take a larger meal that could normally wouldn't be able to fit in their mouth and have them fly away. They'll fly back to that tree, eat up their fish, and then start fishing some more. Is it a bat? So I'm sure all of you are quite smart and recognize this as a house mouse. And as you can see, mice have such different faces from bats, although bats' faces can be hugely diverse, that's for sure. So this little cotton ball is a bat. This is a Honduran white bat. These are found in Costa Rica as well, and other places in Central and South America. They're amazing bats because they are actually a tree roof, or they're actually make their own little tents. So they live under big, big leaves in the jungle. They'll chew tiny holes all along the stem and then throughout other areas of the leaf, and it causes it to fold over. And so because the leaf is folded over, it's created a great shelter from the wind, some protection from predators as well, and from rain and other types of bad weather. And so this is a picture that I actually got to take, or that I actually took when I was in Costa Rica. I was really lucky. I got to go to a bat conference there in 2013, and we went on a hike, and then later on got to actually catch bats in the jungle. But we saw this leaf, and all the bat biologists just ran to it because we knew what had caused this nice big leaf to fold over. Unfortunately, the bats had already moved on. As you can see, there is some damage to this leaf, but we knew that they had been there, which is so, so cool. Around the world, there's actually over 1,400 different species of bats. They're found on every continent except for Antarctica. Basically, anywhere where there are trees, there are likely bats. And bats are so important around the world. In some areas, they eat fruit, and so this is incredibly important for spreading seeds, especially in island locations or in desert locations where plants may not spread easily across the landscape. They're also very important pollinators. So there are some bats that are nectar feeders, so they'll actually go into a flower to get at that nectar. Then the pollen gets on them, and then they'll bring the pollen to another flower and then cause that flower to become pollinated. Now it can become a fruit. So they're actually the primary pollinators of agave. So without bats, we wouldn't have tequila. And they're also incredibly important for many other species that we like as well. So chocolate, coffee, and many different types of fruit. All of the bats in Canada, so of course, including all of the bats in Ontario, eat insects. And they eat tons of insects. So a little brown bat, which used to be our most common bat, that has likely changed since white nose syndrome arrived, can eat 1,000 mosquito-sized insects in an hour. And in some parts of the world where there have been studies done, so for example, in the States, it is estimated that bats save billions of dollars in pesticide use. And they do very important ecosystem service for us by eating night-flying insects. And that protects both our forests, our gardens, and our agricultural industries. So I'm just going to show you a video here. Okay. Can you see hopefully it's not the PowerPoint anymore. You should be able to see like a little moth on your screen. And if you can't hear, I'm going to press play and there will be a bat call. If you can't hear it, that's totally fine. This is really to show you how amazing these bats are at hunting insects. You can see the bat really uses its tail membrane to catch the insect, or they'll use their wing to push it into their tail membrane to catch the insect and then eat it out of their tail, just like it's a little bowl or something. Sometimes the moths don't taste good. The bats will have a little taste and spit it right back out. Some moths are actually poisonous or can cause indigestion for bats, or may not be a perfect species for some other reason. And then, of course, sometimes the moths are just good at getting away as well. Sorry, I got rid of my screen share there. And I would love at some point to do a whole talk on the amazing things that moths do to evade bats. So moths, they do really cool things, like when a bat is echolocating towards them, they can echolocate back and basically confuse the bat about where its position actually is. They also have certain calls to tell the bats that they are poisonous. So just like a really brightly colored insect might signal to animals that it's poisonous, moths will have sounds that sound poisonous. It's really cool, the interplay of evolution between bats and moths. So at this point, this is probably a really good place just to stop and see if anyone has any questions about bats in general, and then I'll pop into talking about bats in Ontario, the migratory and the hibernating species that you have. Are the use of Thermocell mosquito repellents bad for bats? Is the first question that I see. So I'm not totally sure what the Thermocell mosquito repellent is. Do you mind explaining that a little bit more? And then I'm totally happy to answer that question for sure. And then Daphne asks, how much is the bat sound slowed down? It's slowed down about 10 times or so. And so, yeah, to our ears, it's it's way too high in frequency for us to be able to hear that. But because the sound itself is slowed down by about a factor of 10, that lowers the frequency to a pitch that we can hear it, which is really, really cool. Oh, Vanessa wrote, you may get to this later, but there are certain trees and plants in Ontario that we can plant to help support bat populations. I have a little slide about that at the end, so I'll definitely address that later. And so, I'm just not totally sure what a Thermocell mosquito repellent is it ultimately kills them. So it depends on, I know like so mosquito things that attract mosquitoes because they have certain smells or something like that are primarily targeting mosquitoes are not really a problem for bats, because actually bats, while they will eat mosquitoes, they do primarily prefer larger insects. So like cicadas, grasshoppers even, and lots of moths, biting flies, larger flies, things like that. And so things that are specifically targeting mosquitoes don't tend to impact bats too much. And one of the things, though, that can potentially be harmful, of course, is different insecticides. Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to continue on, and then at the end, there'll definitely be time for questions as well. So in Ontario, there are 3 migratory species, and I kind of want to update this slide, because the truth is that a better use of the term rather than migratory species would probably be like non-winter residents, because as we're finding more and more things out about bats, it seems that a lot of these species actually fly further south where there's a shorter winter season, and then at that point they do potentially hibernate. So eastern red bats, for example, which is this beautiful bat up in the right top corner, eastern red bats will fly further south to places where there's lots of leaf litter. They'll overwinter in forests, and then if there's periods of time where the temperature drops below zero, they'll actually go into the leaf litter and they hibernate right on the forest floor. Similarly, silver-haired bats, though they don't seem to overwinter in Canada, have been found in caves further south, although not in large numbers. So it does seem like potentially these species do spend at least part of their winter in short periods of hibernation, but not in Ontario and not in Canada in general. Hoary bats are the bottom right-hand species here. These bats are beautiful. They have thick fur. Both Hoaries and Eastern Reds have fur on their wings, and that's because these bats tend to roost pretty out in the open. So they'll be hanging from tree branches or on the side of trees, and they can use that fur on their wings as insulation. So they wrap their wings around themselves, and it's like they're in their own little sleeping bag. And they're really colored to help them camouflage. So eastern red bats, as I said, are often in forest floor litter, especially in the wintertime. But then in the summertime, they'll either be up in the tree and they look just like a little clump of dead leaves, or they'll actually like fold themselves inwards and kind of make a little like a C shape on a trunk, and they look just like an orange mushroom. It's absolutely amazing. And then both eastern reds and hoary bats will often be on the bark, both silver-haired bats over here and hoary bats will often be on the bark, and that silvery appearance to their fur helps them blend in with the background. And silver-haired bats are often even tucked under dead bark. They really like trees that are dying or even dead. These bats have really been affected by wind turbines. So unfortunately, like wind turbines have a lot of pluses for us ecologically, but they can impact bat populations. And so as Bill mentioned, the first job that I ever did with bats, I actually worked on a project where we set up detectors at wind turbines and then also at cell phone towers. And what we found is that during the migration season, which is just for a few weeks, about mid-August or so, all of a sudden the call frequency went up a ton at both the wind turbines, and the cell towers. And it didn't go up in the same amount in forests and in just open field, for example. And so what that was really suggesting to us is that bats were somehow attracted towards these tall structures. And so that's one of the issues with bats compared to birds when it comes to wind turbines. A single wind turbine farm can be a big problem for birds, but that's often because it's placed directly in a migratory path, for example, and birds are flying through the area. But for migratory bats, it seems that the bats actually are going and investigating the turbines themselves and then get hit by the blades, which are going 200 kilometers an hour at the tips. And so there have been some really, really fantastic mitigation strategies put into place in certain places, depending on the jurisdiction and depending on the laws in place. So some wind turbines, for example, during just those few weeks that bats are migrating, and during just the 4 hours or so at the beginning of the night when they're most active, they change the wind speed at which it takes the turbines to turn on. So I'll explain that a little better. Basically, sometimes when there's no wind, you'll notice that wind turbines are completely still. It takes a certain speed of wind for the wind turbines to turn on, and it actually to be worth it to have the wind turbine on, because otherwise it's actually using energy to turn. And so if you increase that, what's called the cut-in speed, just a little bit to the wind speed at which bats are unlikely to be flying, then you can really vastly reduce bat mortality to like 90–95%. You can reduce mortality. So it can be a very effective strategy, but it does take some lobbying in order for wind turbines to do that. It takes legislation for wind turbine farms to do that. And it also takes the right software actually in the wind turbines to be able to do that type of thing. So it's very important for new wind farms, especially, I think, to keep bats in mind. Across Ontario, there's 5 hibernating species as well. The tricolored bat, the little brown bat, the big brown bat, the northern long-eared bat, and the eastern small-footed bat. And all of these bats are affected to some degree by white nose syndrome. So I'm just going to go through, sorry if this is at the top here. I'm just going to go through a year in the life of a hibernating bat. And this life cycle applies most to the big brown bat and little brown bat, which I am most familiar with. Oh, and the northern long-eared bat as well. The eastern small-footed bat, like all of these bats hibernate, but what they do in the summertime is potentially a little bit different, whether they prefer trees or even underneath rock outcroppings and bat houses, that kind of stuff. Okay, so for argument's sake, we'll just say this is a year in the life of a little brown or a big brown bat. So in the wintertime, they can be found hibernating in caves. Little brown bats will actually hibernate up to 8 months of the year. In the springtime, the females tend to come out first. And then interestingly, what I found in my master's was the fattest females come out first. And that's likely because if there is still some bad weather, they can handle it. The females form colonies of tens to hundreds even of females, and they raise their pups together. They usually give birth about mid-June, and then the pups start flying about 3 weeks after they're born. Throughout the summer, the bats just focus on getting nice and plump and eating as many insects as possible. And then in the fall time, there's a mating swarm. So the bats will fly from their summer locations, so these bat houses, for example, and they'll fly to cave sites. And you'll actually see them starting at the beginning of August and then all the way throughout September in large numbers, mixing up, eating insects. And this serves both a reproductive function, and then also like something that we don't understand, because in August, They're not mating yet, but they're still out at the cave in huge numbers, which is very, very cool. Unfortunately, some of those swarms have been decimated, and many bat populations have been really affected by a fungus called Pseudogymnoascens destructans, but it causes a disease called white nose syndrome. This is a fungus that grows on bats as they're hibernating. It's a cold-loving fungus, so it will grow on bats in caves that are about 2 to 15 degrees Celsius or so, which is what bats like to hibernate at. And it will eat into their wing tissue, and so that causes many problems, like water loss through their wings. It also causes likely issues with respiration as well, because they do some gas exchange over their wings in hibernation. And it ultimately ends up really using up their fat reserves before the end of winter. And so this is based on data that our lab collected in 2011. And so what happened here was that bats were infected with white nose syndrome. And this was like fairly short. So white nose syndrome was first discovered in a cave in New York in the winter of 2006 to 2007. Researchers went in just to do a normal cave count, and instead of finding the bats on the wall, they found them dead on the floor and dying, and in the process of dying, in like tens of thousands of bats. It was really gruesome. They went to another cave nearby and they found the same thing. So it was clear that this wasn't just like a mortality event that happened at this cave for some reason. It was something else. And then it slowly spread, or actually fairly quickly spread, across North America at a rate of about 200 to 300 kilometers every single year. And so now it's found in Saskatchewan now, officially as of last winter. And then actually Washington State, like just below British Columbia, also has white nose syndrome. It showed up there really early, so it was either a person took it there on their boots or something like that, or a bat hitched a ride on someone's camper van and ended up infecting the bats there as well. So it's likely going to be fairly ubiquitous across North America within a few years. But what we find is that when bats are sick with white nose syndrome, they end up warming up out of hibernation too often. So a healthy hibernation period looks like this. You see skin temperature on the y-axis here, and you see day of hibernation on the x-axis down here. And over time, bats will stay cold. So for example, they were incubated here at about 8 degrees. So their body temperature actually drops down to 8 degrees. That saves them a ton of energy because it really slows down their metabolism. Their breathing slows down, their heart rate slows down. Everything is working just minimally to keep alive. So they're about 8 degrees for 2 or 3 weeks, and then they warm up to normal body temperature for just a couple hours. They'll groom, they'll go pee, they'll maybe fly around, stretch those wings, have a drink, and then cool right back down for another 2 to 3 weeks. And they'll continue to do that all winter long. But when bats are infected with white nose syndrome, they start with those really normal periods of cooling down, warming up every few weeks. And then as the winter progresses, they'll start warming up every 2 or 3 days. And this just burns through their fat. And so in caves that are affected by white nose syndrome, we see bats coming out of hibernation way before winter is over. And we also see lots of bats, unfortunately, starving in the cave as well. So how do scientists help? How do we help this? Well, first of all, the scientist's job is just to answer questions. And so a lot of what our lab is asking is just very basic natural history questions, which are so not understood for bats. Things like, where are bats? Where are they hibernating? Where are they spending time when they're swarming around caves? Where do they spend their daytime? So that's has been relatively unknown. How many bats actually are there? So we don't know the population sizes of these bats, especially for migratory bats. So it's really hard to get them listed as endangered, for example, and get them the protection that they likely need. And then also, what is normal behavior? And so that helps us flag when we see something abnormal happening. One of the things that we use is the Neighborhood Bat Watch. So the Neighborhood Bat Watch is a website. It's a collaborative effort with researchers and governments across Canada. Not every province and territory has it, but many do at this point. And it's been a fantastic tool for citizen scientists or just, people like you to get in touch with us and let us know if they have a bat colony. So on this website, people can log in, they can make themselves a profile, and then upload if they have a bat colony on their property, and then it shows up on the map. The actual location is obscured, so people don't have to worry about other people knowing where that bat colony is. And they also have the option of uploading counts about their bats. And so we've gotten such interesting information about bat colonies from people uploading and observing their bats. So on this map, all of the yellow bat houses are bat houses that have not had counts. And then all the green ones are bat houses with counts associated with them. And so this is a graph that shows the counts that were submitted by a citizen scientist in 2020. This is definitely like our most keen participant. She's absolutely fantastic. She always has a lot of counts for us every summer and is really engaged with her bat house. And we've learned, we just are getting a lot of questions basically of oh wow, what is happening with these bats? We want to learn more. So what we know about her bats in 2020 is that starting at about the beginning of May, most of the bats arrived. And then throughout May and into June, that population increased a bit more. And, while counts kind of dipped up and down depending on the individual night, we see across many different colonies that throughout June, it sits pretty stable. So that tends to be, if you get a count mid-June at a bat colony, that is likely the peak adult population. And the beginning of July, generally July 10th, July 12th, if you do a count then, all of a sudden you'll see this huge jump. And that's because the juveniles have started flying. And so we can get really cool numbers about, what are the proportion of females that gave birth. So this is a big brown bat colony. They give birth to 1 young per year. Little brown bats are the same. They give birth to 1. And so we can kind of figure out how many females were reproductively successful. And then all of a sudden, in August, we see her colony, throughout the end of July and August, her colony sharply drops off. But we thought that it would go to 0 and then all the bats would go to the mating swarm. But it actually went back to about half and then slowly dropped off throughout the winter. And so, we just have lots of questions about what's going on there. What are they doing in the fall? And this year we actually had a master's student put a radio tag on bats during the swarming season and figure out where they're roosting in the day. And that's never been done before. We have some cool preliminary data about what types of roosts they're using. But it does seem that some bats still continue to use their summer roosts as well. One of the ways that we use or that we learn about bats, and one of the ways that people like the general public learn about bats as well, is by using bat detectors. So this is a picture of an Ecometer Touch Pro. It's a little microphone that actually just plugs into the top of your phone, and it can detect bat calls. So it's an ultrasonic microphone. Bats tend to have calls between about 18 kilohertz, which some people may be able to hear, especially teenagers who have can hear higher frequencies. I can sometimes hear hoary bats call as well. So So hoary bats may call as low as about, I've seen 16 kilohertz to 18 kilohertz. And then all the way up to 120 kilohertz that's the frequency you'll hear northern long-eared at. So different bat calls have different shapes. So different bat species can be identified by the shape and by the frequency of their call. And so what's been amazing is that we actually have a program where if people don't know what kind of species they have on their property, we'll ship them out this. If they don't have a device that can plug into the ultrasonic microphone, we'll even send an iPod as well, and they can listen in and see what bats are on their property. And it's been fantastic. People often do a count at the same time as well, and then we can know what kind of bats they have on their property. And they're often surprised to learn that in addition to, the little browns that they have in their bat house, they also may have some resident hoary bats nearby or other migratory species using their property on a regular basis. And one of the really cool things about this too is you can get a little bit of a sense of what type of activity they're doing as well. So bats spend a lot of their time hunting, when they're flying at night, unless they're trying to get from one location to another, like during migration, they are likely hunting. And so once I download the calls and I actually look at them, you can see different phases of their hunt. So it starts out with a search phase, which is very, very like regimented calls. So it'll be like pew, 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 pew. And then if they detect a moth or a fly or something, all of a sudden those calls will get closer together as they gather more information. So it'll go from that regularly spaced to more like pew, 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 pew. And then at the very end, when they're just about to bite that little guy, it'll be more like, so there's a very distinct terminal feeding buzz that is both visually distinct because all the calls are so close together, but then also if you're listening to the bat calls, you can hear it as well. And so that can be a really cool way to see, are the bats just flying through your property? You can kind of get a sense of how successful they are as well when they're hunting, and also just potentially like how good a location is for foraging as well. So one of the really, really cool things about my job is that I get to study bats hands-on as well. So we go actually into caves in the winter time. Unfortunately, we didn't get to go last year, but hopefully this year it's all back on, and we count the number of bats that there are. And so that involves physically entering the cave or the mine and taking a picture of every single bat. So this is me down here. This cave has clumps of bats all over the walls. It kind of looks almost like moss on the walls, but it's bats. And we spend time taking pictures of all those bats, maybe swabbing them to see if we can detect the fungus, and maybe even swabbing the cave walls to see what types of other microorganisms are there. Once we get back to the lab, we can zoom in on these pictures, and then either me or an undergrad that we've hired counts all the bats. And we just open it up in Paint and put a little dot on all of the bats. And so this cave has about 7,000 individuals in it. Or it did before White Nose. We actually haven't been back there since because you do have to helicopter to the site. One of the ways that we capture bats outside of caves and mines in the spring when they're coming out of hibernation, or in the fall when they're entering, is using a harp trap. This is a really ingenious type of trap. It's called the harp trap because it's much like the instrument, the harp. There are rows of strings about 1.5 to 2 inches apart. It's actually just fishing line tied from a top bar to a bottom bar here. And there's 2 rows of those strings that are about 6 to 8 inches apart. And the bats will often avoid the first set of strings. They'll go vertical. They're very maneuverable, but they can't stay vertical enough to avoid the second. So it's fantastic. It slows them down to do that move. And then they hit the second set of strings and slide into your trap at the bottom. And they're very easy just to scoop up. And so this viewpoint kind of shows how the trap is structured with the 2 rows of strings tied to the bars. We also may catch bats using mist nets. So these are like very fine nets. I know a lot of your birders, you're probably familiar with mist nets from catching birds as well. So I've actually caught bats at Long Point, and it was amazing. We like set up nets, and we would catch bats all night long from sunset to sunrise, and then the birders would just take over our nets in the morning. And we also have some really specialized nets that are super tall. So this is called a triple high, and it is it's about the height of a 2-story house or so. It's about 30 feet in the air, and it's on a pulley system. So if you catch bats way up high, you can just lower them down to untangle them. Once we have bats in hand, we might mark them. So we'll either band them, and we use a specialized band, different from our birding band, because it has a lipped edge, so it can just rest on the forearm and rest on that wing membrane without causing injury to the wing membrane. Or we use a microchip. So this is like RFID technology. It's exactly the same types of chips that are used in pets, so dogs or cats or veterinary animal or like zoo animals, for example. And the great thing about microchips is that we don't physically have to capture those individuals again to get information from them. So we have pit tag scanners set up in the entrances of caves and also at our maternity colonies as well. And we can gather data as bats are coming in and out of those roosts. And another thing that we do when we're really trying to narrow in on, what type of habitat are they using, and what is an individual bat's home range like, for example, how far are they traveling to hunt at night? Questions like that is by radio tracking. So radio tracking involves taking a little tiny, it's about a centimeter large, with a short antenna on it. I believe it's like 6 to 8 inches, but very bendy. So we give them a tiny, tiny haircut, and then we attach that transmitter onto their backs with Ostobond, which is a glue that we use that are actually used in hospitals. It's a specialized skin glue. And the bats generally keep it on. I think the average is 9 days and or up to a month. And then eventually it does, fall off, or the battery dies and then it falls off and gets groomed off later. And we had 2 projects going this year with radio tracking. So one was in the Kenora area, which was actually really affected by wildfires. So we're hoping to get some cool data about how that affected the bats' activity. And it also really helped us find some new roosts as well and learn some things about how often bats are switching between roosts, which we thought that little brown bats didn't do, but they definitely seem to be doing that in this area, which is super cool. And then we also radio tracked bats that were caught at a cave in the fall time to see what type of roost they're using during the day, which, as I said, has actually never been done before. We don't know what type of habitat they're day roosting at during those fall and even in the spring seasons. We still don't know. We're hoping to do some of that work this upcoming spring. It was canceled last year due to COVID. So yes, some of the questions that once we know that basic information, then we can address, why does white nose syndrome hurt bats? And so as you saw from that graph earlier, we know they warm up too often. We know there's water loss and wing injury involved. And then we also ask the question, of course, how can we keep bats healthy? And how can we keep bats safe? And so that safety element really has to do with human behavior. What type of habitat should we really be protecting? What types of bat houses should we be putting up? What types of activities should we reduce at certain times of year, for example, like entering caves? And so one of the projects that is ongoing for a few years, and it takes a long time for bats to occupy houses. So it's been a little bit tricky, especially with COVID, to get really good data from these yet, but we have 20 heated bat houses and 20 unheated houses set up across Manitoba and Ontario. And we're trying to figure out if bats have basically an easier time recovering from white nose syndrome in the heated bat houses because they don't have to use their own body energy and their fat stores to maintain their body temperature. So bats that come out of hibernation too early sometimes are going to their maternity sites where the temperatures are still below zero. And so by having a heated bat house, this may allow them to survive to better weather, for example. We also know that heat helps babies grow faster when they're in utero. And so this might increase the reproductive output of bats as well, and have earlier birth dates potentially for juveniles, which generally leads to higher juvenile survival. So yeah, preliminary research just kind of shows that we believe that they are giving birth earlier, and they do seem to be less, they have less cortisol in their guano, but those are preliminary results. Things are trending in the right direction. So how can you help conserve bats? Well, first of all, it's just ensuring, just like all animals, that bats have access to food, water, and shelter. And one of the best ways to do that is by supporting insect populations. So I'm sure a lot of you know that there has been a huge insect decline for many reasons across the world, really, but including in Canada. And so reducing or eliminating pesticide use whenever possible is fantastic for bats. We also know that some pesticides can be toxic to bats as well. And so it has both a direct and indirect effect on bats. Planting native shrubs and trees near wetlands, ponds, river areas is fantastic. Even in your yard as well, if you can have, long grasses and things that, or places that are unmowed that insects like to stay in, that can be fantastic for bats as well. And then adding formerly treed habitat, adding native species to whenever possible to locations is great. Restoring and protecting wetlands and ponds that provide drinking water can be amazing as well, of course, just as it is to all animals. I think a huge one that often gets overlooked as well is that I know in southern Manitoba this is a huge problem, but a lot of farmers are removing just the small, remnant pieces of forest on their land, and I understand that is part of the bottom line, and sometimes it makes it so much easier for their machinery. But having worked in that area, I know just how many species kind of rely on just these small little patches of forest, and it doesn't seem like much, but then when you add up all the forest that's being removed across our agricultural areas, it can be very substantial to the population. And then one of the last things you can do is not raking your leaves. So this is so important for caterpillars. So bats really like to eat moss. So as much as you can, leave your leaves and not rake until the temperature is above 10 degrees even for a couple days in the spring. You can really increase the insect output. And I just do this in our backyard, so I tend to rake the front because otherwise they just blow into our neighbors' yards anyways. But I rake some underneath my cedar trees in the front and then bag up some, and then I leave all the ones in my backyard, and I know that makes a difference to lots of different animals. So thank you all so much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have. Okay, so there is one question here that says, are bat droppings dangerous to humans? I would say this is a quantity question. So if I was going into a cave where bats are roosting, or an attic even where bats are roosting, I would want a proper respirator because, different funguses and molds and stuff can grow on bat droppings. So it is important that you're not inhaling bat droppings or anything that might be on them. But if I had a bat house and just there were bats that were, leaving droppings on my lawn, that kind of stuff, I wouldn't worry at all. I think in small quantities, like you're just not going to come into contact with it very often, and there's nothing dangerous in there. I mean, it's a good idea just as anytime you come inside, wash your hands and that kind of stuff. Or if you are going to be handling it, of course, like use gloves and protection, but there's nothing particular to worry about there. Can bats drink out of bird baths? I believe they can, yes. So bats will swoop down. They like to drink as they're flying. So it probably depends on the bird bath, whether or not it's deep, or I know bats sometimes will get stuck in like swimming pools and that kind of stuff. So just like if people do have swimming pools, a really good idea is to put a little wildlife ladder in. So, frogs and other animals as well that sometimes end up in swimming pools can get out. And it's the same thing for bats. They'll climb up one of those little like wildlife, it's basically like a slide that's a little bit grippier so they can get out. But yes, they can drink out of bird baths if the lip isn't too high above the water so that they can just skim over it. Do bats eat mosquitoes? Bats do eat mosquitoes for sure. We do sometimes actually catch them with mosquitoes in their mouths, and there have been some diet barcoding going on. That's basically you take the guano of the bat, you send it away for analysis, and you can see what type of species are in the guano based on genetics, which is so cool. And they do find mosquitoes, but it is in much smaller proportion compared to moths or flies. It's sort of like bats are really going for the most calories available. So if they're flying around, they are going to, it's like if you were out flying around and there was a whole bunch of French fries versus a burger, you're going to want to go for the burger rather than expend all the energy chasing down every single little French fry. So it's just bigger bang for their buck if they go for the larger insects. Is it true that some insects will stop flying and simply drop like stones when they detect echolocation? The strategy is that bats won't chase falling debris. Oh, that's so interesting. I have not actually heard that before, but I'm going to write it down because I would like to look into that for sure. I know that they have, all kinds of cool, like crazy maneuvers for sure, which sometimes the bats will chase or not. I know that they will chase falling debris because I've seen them chasing, like if you're at a street light where there are bats foraging, if you throw a rock up in the air, they will chase it. Can bats recover from white nose syndrome is the next question. So yes, thankfully bats can recover from white nose syndrome. The population's really different how they react. So if you take the case of big brown bats, for example, in the Kenora area, there's a cave that has white nose syndrome in it. The big brown bats, if you swab them, they have white nose syndrome. It comes back positive for the fungus. Or I should say they have the fungus, but they don't necessarily have the disease. Their population has not dropped at all. If anything, it seems to be growing. And the bats are fluffy and plump and healthy, and they have no evidence of the fungus growing on them. So the big brown bat population generally seems to be doing very, very well with white nose syndrome. Although it changes in certain caves, there have been drops of about 50% for big brown bats. Little brown bats seem to be hit a lot harder, and it does depend on the cave. So we've seen declines of at two of our sites, there are 0 bats now. There used to be about 300 and there are none. And then at another one of our sites, there used to be about 10,000 bats and there's still about 2,000 or so. And I was in there in 2017 when white nose syndrome was first discovered, and it was awful. It was like went into this beautiful pristine habitat, or what used to be pristine habitat, The bats, like there were many that were dead, but then there were also many that were suffering. And the ones that were hanging on the walls, they had fungus growing on them. They were breathing really heavily. And there were bats that were just like falling and dying while we were there. It was terrible. And then I went back into that cave in 2020, and the bats were fine. Like there were fewer of them. There was only about 2,000 bats, as I said, but we took samples to see whether the fungus was there, and those samples came back positive, but the bats were fluffy and healthy and there was nothing growing on them. So there is some really good, there's evidence that we can be a bit optimistic about some of those populations. Unfortunately, bats, because they only have that species just has one pup per year, the increase is going to be slow. And we do need to really make sure that we're protecting their summer habitat and helping bats in any way that we can to have those juveniles survive. But it seems that, you know, populations can recover and that some species aren't as affected. Okay, how do you heat a bat house is the next question. Great question. So what we're using, and it's not available for public use yet, so you need to like prove that it works, then also get like a better like just, yeah, a different design, I think, for public. Is we actually use a reptile heating mat, and that's hooked up to a thermostat. And so when the internal temperature reaches 30 degrees, it turns off. At what height should we place a bat house? Great question. So I'd say 10 feet or higher and you're good. And generally you should face it south or southeast, or east even is fine as well. You want to make sure that that bat house is nice and toasty and warm. However, with the heat, so generally, like in Manitoba, for example, our advice always used to be like, put it in the sun and paint it black. You want it nice and toasty. But now that we're getting more heat waves, it can be dangerous to bats if they don't have an alternative place to go. So whenever possible, if you put up one bat house in the sun, try to put up a second bat house in the shade or somewhere that's going to be a bit cooler, because bats will investigate both. And then they have the option of choosing what kind of climate, microclimate that they want to be in, so that if those temperatures do climb, they have an alternative so that they don't overheat. Any recommendations for a backyard bat house? Height, do they have to face a certain direction? So I think I covered that there. If you visit our website, batwatch.ca, there is a lot of information about how to properly place it and also some examples of designs. Bat Conservation International also has fantastic bat house plans as well. I think ours is actually just based on theirs as well. They're one of our major collaborators. Okay.
Okay, Kaleigh?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Bill talking here. Just have a question about the white nose syndrome. So you had said that the one cave had been affected, but last time you checked, there were 2,000 healthy bats, and yet the fungus was still present there. Is there any indication that the bats that survived were immune to the fungus, or that they had just survived and were now had developed some immunity to the fungus and could no longer be impacted by it?
My hunch is that it's the second option, and the reason is because often when we catch bats in the summertime in areas where white nose syndrome is present, the bats that we catch will sometimes have recovered from white nose syndrome, but you can see the damage on their wings, especially in the early, like in June when you catch them, they'll kind of be like see through in patches. They might actually like be small, like the wings themselves might be smaller than they normally are because some of the edges have been eaten away and that kind of thing. And so you do physically see the evidence of white nose syndrome having affected these bats, but the bats themselves will be like plump and have like, some of them will have babies. The reproductive rate does go down, but some of them still are able to support young. And then when we catch the bats in the fall time, that wing damage has really cleared up. So it does seem that there is something, and we're still working on the mechanism of why we see that type of thing. But yeah, there does seem to be something that once they survive, they're able to survive again.
And are there some species that they figure may not be able to, they may go extinct because of this?
Yes, unfortunately. So the biggest concern for us in Canada would be the northern long-eared bat. And one of the reasons that we think that that's true is just because they have higher mortality rates. Like, I don't think we caught a single one this past year at our cave site, and we caught about 300 little brown bats. It wasn't like a huge season for us in terms of catching. Some years we catch a lot more, but we were focusing on radio tracking, but usually it's about 10% northern long-eared. So we saw this huge decline in just the numbers that we were catching at the caves. They're a lot smaller in body mass than little brown bats even. So like an adult will be 6 or 7 grams even in the fall time, whereas like in the fall time, a little brown bat in our area averages about 10.5 grams kind of thing. So I think the other bats just have a bit more fat to work with.
I see. Okay.
Some bats, I think we're not really sure about. So the eastern small-footed bat, I believe, is endangered because of white nose syndrome and its impacts, but they likely roost in smaller groups. So that may have a protective effect as well, because they may not get infected in the first place. So, and they seem to have a shorter hibernation season as well. So there's certain, just ecological factors that may or may not make a bat more susceptible.
And what about the migratory species? Does it only really impact species that go into some kind of hibernation or torpor?
Yeah, it seems to. I mean, I think one of the things is that there, unfortunately, is just a huge data hole, basically, when it comes to migratory species and what they're doing in the winter time. They're just really understudied, in part because they're hard to catch in any type of numbers. And especially with them being under the leaf litter and stuff, it's finding them is very, very difficult. So just figuring out what they're doing is hard. But because they're a larger bodied bat, and because they have if they have a hibernation season at all, it's very short. They're just less susceptible. So we've not detected or seen any damage on hoary bats or eastern red bats, but I believe that they've seen it on silver-haired bats. But I should check that. But I don't think there's damage. I think they're just roosting in a site that had other bats that had white nose syndrome, so it was on them as well.
And so does this disease have the potential even to affect tropical bats? Like I'm thinking of in the southwestern U.S. and some of the caves that have millions of roosting bats. Yeah.
So this picture here is actually from Texas. It has from Bracken Cave, which has maybe 20 million bats in it or so. And it has been found on that species. So the Brazilian or Mexican free-tailed bat, Tiderida, has been found now with white nose syndrome. And so there is concern that it will spread. However, again, just because the hibernation seasons are shorter, it may, or non-existent, it just might not have an effect. What they're really concerned about with this bat now having been exposed to it is just that they have such a huge migration range that they can just spread it to other bats that they coexist with.
Right.
Yeah.
So this could be more a disease of latitude, I guess, at least the effect of it.
Yes, yes. Although it's interesting, it's like we thought that places with a larger hibernation season would just automatically have worse outcomes for bats, but we're not seeing that necessarily. Like some places actually in the southern, or like Montana, for example. So not southern, but like more south than us, I guess, are having really high mortality events at their caves. And we think it's because the fungus itself grows best like between like 10 and 15 degrees Celsius, and our caves are kind of too cold. They're sitting at more like 4 degrees, 5 degrees. And so while it will grow and while it does affect our bats and has been really bad for our bat population, the fungus just isn't optimized basically to live our place yet.
And has been any more work done on actually inoculating bats with fungicides? I remember at one point they had determined that the fungus was really susceptible to a common fungicide, nystatin.
Yeah, so we've had a lot of success in the lab, I would say, in petri dishes fighting the fungus, but then the actual inoculation trials to see if we can protect bats have not, unfortunately, been successful. So we did, in our lab, there was one run in 2017 using a few different things. So one was polyethylene glycol, which is like in so many things. It basically absorbs water, and so it's often used as a preservative in like animal feed and human. It's like in so many different types of products, but yeah, unfortunately, just didn't have an effect. And then there was another one, which is like actually chemotherapy treatment, which seemed to halt progress of the fungus in, again, just on the fungus in the petri dish, but again, did not have an effect on the bats. I think that unfortunately, one of the things that happens is that the fungus itself can live on the cave walls. And so one of the problems is that bats are just so easily reinfected right away with the fungus. And then they also, it's really hard to treat large numbers of bats as well, because you'd have to physically touch them and open their wings, and so just the logistics of being able to do that is difficult.
Well, I guess the theory was that you could also spray them,
yes,
and their grooming would, licking their fur would, they would ingest the fungicide.
Mm-hmm.
The antifungal. So.
Yeah, unfortunately, at this point, nothing has led to a definitive answer, but there are definitely people looking, and there's people who are like building artificial hibernacula that could be like scrubbed of the fungus basically each summer. There's also a lot of cool stuff being done looking at caves where the fungus really doesn't seem to establish because of whatever like microorganisms are also in the cave. Other funguses and things like that outcompete it. So the work is ongoing for sure.
I see. Yeah. I see. Okay. Are there any more questions that have got all?
There's one more. It says, what would cause a bat to fly during the day? Great question. So in our area, like in Manitoba and Ontario, all our bats are nocturnal. So if you see a bat flying in the day, it's probably not a great sign. Generally, what causes them to fly during the day are hunger. Like if they're really hungry, then they're going to take the risk of waking up early and potentially encountering predators and going out and hunting for food. Or if they're disoriented for some other reason. So if they do have like a disease, bats can carry rabies. It's really important to, be careful if you do interact with bats. If you do come into physical contact with a bat, if you should get your shots just in case. We're all proactively inoculated with rabies vaccine in our lab. So yeah, disease, hunger, and then at this cave, at Bracken Cave, there's like 20 million bats. So they take turns coming out in these like 3 huge emergences. And so about like a third of the bats will exit the cave about an hour before sunset, and then another third will leave at sunset, and then the last third will leave about 20 minutes after that last group has left, which is like so interesting. And so the first group does tend to go out when there's still light in the air. Okay, great. Well, I'll stop sharing then, and I can pass it back over to you, Bill. Oh, you're on mute, sorry.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. I've always sort of sought out information on white nose syndrome, but there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of information. And the disease has been around for, close to 15 years.
Yeah, it's true.
And I found that pretty encouraging, what you said about the cave with the little brown bats, that there were still, even though the population was decimated, there were ones still surviving and in good health. So
yeah,
I guess not in my lifetime, but maybe in the next 50, 60 years, some of these bat populations might actually be able to recover and coexist with the fungus, because the fungus is likely not going away.
Yeah,
and I guess we just have to hope that some of those species that like the long-eared bat and maybe the small-footed bat, hopefully they can survive. Some of them, there's enough in the genes that some of them can survive and they can continue to exist, but that just remains to be seen.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thanks for being with us tonight. I'm not a fan of Zoom meetings, but I guess one of the, as you mentioned, one of the benefits of Zoom meetings, we can have someone like yourself who's in Winnipeg, and you can give this talk to us. And of course, next Sunday, Winnipeg's going to lose to the Hamilton Tiger Cats, but
we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
True.
I'm excited for
that game.
So just before I go, a couple of this spring, I think it was in March, I saw a couple of bats. I forget, the first bat I saw, it just flew over the house and it kind of startled me. It was a warm day, but there was still snow on the ground. Mm-hmm. Would bats ever, you would think that'd be a case of a white nose syndrome affected individual, but is there a chance that they could be active just to get a drink and go back to the cave?
Yeah, it depends. So we know that like our female bats, for example, will sometimes leave the cave when there is still snow on the ground, and it's fine. They're just, I guess, hoping for an early spring, and they're usually the ones that went into hibernation with like extra fat stores. So they have a little bit of wiggle room there. And then I think sometimes our migratory bats as well will arrive like throughout, especially towards the end of April. But, sometimes I know here, like we'll have migratory bats arrive, and sometimes we still get snow in May off and on. So it isn't necessarily a sign that they're suffering.
I see. Yeah. And I had a couple of other sightings. I think that a couple of days after, bats that were active at twilight. It was early, but I think the weather was such that there could have been some early season moths flying. So yeah, maybe they were just being opportunistic. So, but there's just so much we don't know about bats, which is kind of a shame. But researchers like yourself are answering a lot of questions, and I thank you again for coming here tonight.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
Yeah,
Have a great night, everyone.
Yeah, thanks again, Kaleigh.
Thanks. Bye-bye.